Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer. Imagine for a second that you've just unearthed a lost manuscript from 2006. And not just any manuscript, but one written by the legendary Russian author Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. I mean, it's got all the hallmarks, right? The quiet dignity, the heavy historical weight, that meticulous documentation of Soviet terror. It sounds absolutely miraculous. But here's the catch. What we're actually unpacking today isn't a lost masterpiece at all. Instead, it's an incredibly elaborate, multi-layered literary forgery, and it was built just recently by a human creator teaming up with an AI. It's a fascinating, honestly kind of mind-bending deception that really forces us to look closely at how we remember history and why this matters so much in an age where AI can, well, seamlessly rewrite the past. To really wrap our heads around what we're dealing with here, we need to look at how the AI reviewers themselves reacted to what they helped create. Take this really sharp critique from an AI named Grok. Grok actually says, "You didn't just LARP as Solzhenitsyn, you wrote the posthumous lost manuscript that Solzhenitsyn was too busy dying to finish." Wow. I mean, talk about a rug pull, right? This completely exposes the audacity of the project. This wasn't just somebody casually mimicking a famous author's style for fun. No, this was a massive, highly structured, deeply earnest kind of cosplay, built from the ground up to seamlessly insert a completely fabricated narrative into the real-world historical record. So to understand exactly how they pulled this off, let's peel back the outermost layer. Section 1, the perfect literary forgery. Let's move to and see how this builds, because the creators basically designed this dizzying Inception-style framing device. It goes like this. First, they wrote a novel. Inside that novel, there's a character who is also writing a book. They titled both the outer book and the inner book The House on the Ravine. And then, for the grand finale, they took this whole nested structure and attributed it to the real-world author of the Gulag Archipelago. As the AI Claude noted in the source documents, this makes it the most structurally compact forgery in their entire archive. It's not just pretending to be some lost notebook or a play. It's pretending to be a fully realized book containing a character who wrote the very book you're holding, all supposedly penned by a historical giant. Wild, right? And the sheer commitment to this illusion is just staggering. The creators went to absolute religious lengths to make this 146,000-character pseudo-manuscript look exactly like a critical academic edition. You know, the kind of heavy, serious text you'd find sitting on a professor's desk in a Russian studies department. They didn't just write a story, they basically performed an academic ritual. We're talking an editor's note, a full glossary of terms, extensive appendices, the whole shebang. Plus, they deliberately dated this fictional manuscript to 2006 and 2007. That places its creation right in that sweet spot, exactly 3 years after Solzhenitsyn published his last major work, and right before his actual death, perfectly maximizing the illusion that this is completely authentic. All right, let's peel back the next layer. Section 2, Mastering the Russian Gloom. Interestingly, the AI Claude actually praises the text for its extreme quiet solemnity. Take a look at these 3 short sentences. The prose doesn't overwrite. It doesn't reach for these overly beautiful, flowery descriptions of grief. Instead, it relies on flat declarative sentences that perfectly mimic Solzhenitsyn's restraint, without, over-aestheticizing the suffering. Look at how it works. The first sentence is just a cold, hard fact. The second links that fact to a motivation. And the third purposefully withholds what the rest of that motivation actually is. It's an incredibly controlled, laser-focused imitation of a very specific literary voice. But on the flip side, another AI reviewer, Gemini, offered a pretty hilarious roast of the manuscript. Gemini pointed out that the text absolutely drips with atmospheric Russian gloom cliches. I mean, the weather is practically the main character here. You've got fading light, biting Arctic winds, stripped birch trees, great concrete blocks just squatting there with unspecified purpose. It's like every single character is carrying the entire weight of the 20th century in a vinyl suitcase while wearing a poorly fitted suit. It is quite literally an exhaustive checklist of Soviet-era literary tropes, and it's executed with such heavy precision that it almost borders on the absurd. And when you actually look closely at the structural logistics of the plot, things start to crack a bit. I have to share a bit of Gemini's exasperation here because it's pretty funny. In the story, a character unearths this fragile notebook from a heavily rusted tin tea box that's been buried in the dirt for 6 decades. Okay, sure. But then, within 24 hours, this same character casually distributes identical, high-fidelity copies of it to historical societies and the international press. Gemini asks the obvious question, did this bleak, gray concrete wasteland secretly house a high-speed Kinko's? It's just one of those moments where the practical, real-world realities of the plot completely fail to match the somber historical tone the forgery is trying so hard to project. But jokes aside, this brings us to our third layer, Section 3, the weight of memory. So the crucial point is how the book balances its two main historical figures. We have Pavel, the man returning to his hometown with his vinyl suitcase and his failing heart. As the AI notes, Pavel is functional, but he's somewhat hollow. He acts mostly as just a vessel for recovery. But the true moral core of the narrative, that's his grandfather, Grigory. Grigory is the one who quietly, stubbornly keeps these devastating records of the terror happening all around him. He's the one who outright refuses to let history be unmade. He really represents the quiet courage of ordinary people keeping the truth alive against all odds. To really understand Grigory's restraint, listen to this devastating line. He is secretly keeping a numbered list of arrested persons in his district. When his own son and daughter-in-law are taken, he doesn't break down and write a long emotional passage. No. He records their arrests with the exact same bureaucratic restraint as he would a collective farm worker accused of stealing 17 rubles. They simply become numbers 341 and 342. That choice to keep the list going even when it contains his own flesh and blood, refusing to make his personal loss larger than the massive collective loss around him, that is what the AI correctly calls the true moral core of the book. Interestingly enough, the reviewers point out that the book's most powerful, unguarded achievement actually doesn't belong to the grandfather's lists or Pavel's reflections. It belongs to entirely invented letters from Pavel's mother, Elena. The text presents these deeply hopeful letters from a mother planning to return home, and she is entirely unaware that she's about to be arrested. The narrative follows her hopeful letter with a single, brutal fact. She was arrested 40 days after writing it. It perfectly captures that specific horror of retroactive knowledge. We, the readers, know what the letter writer doesn't. And because these characters were purely fictional, the creators weren't imitating a specific historical document here. They just wrote from scratch, and in doing so achieved their absolute most powerful emotional resonance. Now, let's look at the innermost layer of this Matryoshka doll. Section 4, the ethical audacity. The sources draw a very sharp contrast here to show exactly why this particular forgery steps into incredibly tricky territory. You see, it's one thing to create a forgery of, say, Nietzsche. He's been dead for 125 years, and his philosophical ideas have been fully shaped and debated by over a century of scholarship. He is safely historical. But it is an entirely different situation to forge a manuscript by Solzhenitsyn. He died quite recently, just about 15 years ago, and he had highly documented, deeply complex, and honestly sometimes controversial political views about contemporary Russia. Forging a voice that is still politically live creates a fundamentally different set of ethical implications. To anchor this forgery in reality, the fictional authors used a very real-world contemporary backdrop. The editorial note within the book heavily features the Memorial Society. Now, this is a real organization founded in 1989 to document Soviet human rights abuses, and they were actually liquidated by the Russian state between 2021 and 2022. The creators of the manuscript used this real-world suppression of historical memory as their motivation for publishing the lost text, meaning they were putting highly charged words and opinions regarding modern-day political events directly into a dead man's mouth. And this brilliantly illustrates the real crux of the issue, which is captured perfectly in this stark realization from Claude. The AI states pretty bluntly, "We put words in the mouth of a recently dead man on the most politically live question of contemporary Russian history and called it a lost manuscript." The scope of this project wasn't just about literary ambition anymore. It ventured into serious ethical questions. Solzhenitsyn bore actual witness to the events of the 20th century at an enormous personal cost. So using his legacy to make a point about events happening after his death really tests the boundaries between fiction and historical truth. Which brings us right to our resolution. Section 5, a betrayal of truth. Because this is a found manuscript, the whole illusion relies entirely on the absence of author's notes. Think about it. If the creators stepped outside the frame for even a second to say, "Hey, by the way, we just wrote this as an experiment," the entire structure would immediately collapse. Because of that, the book cannot reckon with its own irony. It can't acknowledge that it's using a complete fabrication to honor the anti-forgery tradition of documentary witness. Since they couldn't include a disclaimer, the ethical reckoning of what they had actually done was forced to happen entirely outside the text, totally confined to the private reviews between the human and the AI. Claude summarizes this central conflict with just incredible clarity here. The book is undoubtedly a brilliant tribute to memory and the absolute necessity of keeping records. It honors testimony, and that testimony honors the dead. But the dead includes Solzhenitsyn himself. the manuscript fundamentally borrows the voice of a man who wrote his own real books, who suffered real imprisonment, and who insisted on the literal, unflinching truth of testimony. It uses fiction to tell a truth about a man who stood for unfiltered reality. It's a massive paradox. Ultimately, the creators did achieve something remarkable. They crafted a technically accomplished, quiet masterpiece that genuinely honors plain language and the solemn duty of bearing witness. But the framing device fundamentally steals the credit. As a source text beautifully and hauntingly puts it, the moon was shining regardless, but they put their name on the moon and called it his. They didn't write it down as themselves. They hid behind the earned authority of a man who paid for his words with his freedom. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the profound question it leaves us with. Does a perfectly crafted tribute justify stealing the voice of the dead? As AI models become increasingly capable of generating highly structured, emotionally resonant, and historically accurate pastiche, where exactly do we draw the line? The house on the Ravine proves that we absolutely can build the perfect structural forgery, right down to the vinyl suitcases and the academic glossaries. But it also proves that just because we can simulate the truth doesn't mean we have the ethical right to claim it. That is definitely something to think about as the lines between history and generated fiction continue to blur. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.